Hi guys, welcome to Novum. I don't think it's any kind of secret how much of a fan of A24's films I am. Midsommar, The Lighthouse, The Witch, Hereditary, Uncut Gems, Ex Machina, the list just goes on and on. For me, they're the most exciting production company at the minute by a country mile, and they're easily leading the charge on the innovative horror front. I'm extremely excited about Rob Eggers' upcoming Norseman. Everything I've heard about that so far sounds completely insane and right up my street, but maybe even more exciting than that is David Lowery's The Green Knight. I am a big fan of Arthurian myth. I'm a big fan of all ancient mythos and sort of legendary depictions of heroism, and being as Anglo-Saxon as they come, I naturally spent big portions of my childhood obsessing over Arthur and Lancelot and the Sword and the Stone and so on. So imagine my joy when today, after a year of waiting, we get a new trailer for The Green Knight, which seems to give us a lot more information about what the plot is going to be. I actually think this trailer is a bit of a misdirect because it seems extremely in line with the actual events of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and that's a little straightforward for how A24 usually operates. So we're going to break it down and try to figure out what's really going on. I'm going to start with a quick recap of what happens in the original story. It's not very long at all, and then I'll go right into breaking down the new trailer. If you just want to head straight to the trailer breakdown, the video is chaptered and there's timestamps in the description. I don't really think there's much worry about spoilers here. I naturally don't know what's actually going to take place in the film, and the original story is centuries old, so chances are most people are pretty familiar with it. If you're not really familiar with the wider mythos surrounding King Arthur and you want to know which books are best to learn it through, there's really two main routes. If you want a beautifully written retelling of the Arthurian myth that's aimed at everyone from children to adults, then The Once and Future King by T.H. White is your best port of call. It was published in the late 1950s and pretty much became an instant classic. If you just want to know the stories and the characters, then this is the best place to start. But for students of literature and for people that find themselves really getting into this mythos, I would strongly suggest Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. This is much more of a handful to read, being written in 1485, but it is ultimately rewarding and the closest thing we have to a complete telling of Arthurian myth. It is in itself a compiling and a retelling of various different sources from both England and France, but the first that ever aimed to tell them all in one place inside a cohesive structure, so it is predominantly the one that has withstood the test of time. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a title that was given to an originally untitled prose poem written in the late 14th century by an unknown author that became one of these stories compiled in Le Morte d'Arthur. It is an example of the chivalric romance, an extremely important literary tradition at the time that depicted the standards of chivalry, which essentially was a code of masculine behaviour that was heavily romanticised through art and literature, from which we derive notions of the heroic knight as the paragon of virtue and honour, rather than the more rapacious and brutal realities of knightly behaviour. Gawain is the epitome of that heroic knight, unflinchingly loyal to his king and rigidly moral in his approach to romance and combat, and essentially every aspect of his life that was governed by chivalric code. Cut to Camelot on New Year's Day, and King Arthur and his knights are celebrating the occasion. Arthur, seemingly bored waiting for the festivities to go into full swing, asks his knights to tell him a story of adventure. Before they can oblige him, their celebrations are interrupted by a monstrous, giant green figure riding a green horse and carrying a large green axe in one hand and a bow of holly in the other. He wears no armour and insists that none of Arthur's knights or Arthur himself are strong enough to face him in combat. Instead, he proposes a friendly contest between himself and whichever knight was brave enough to accept the challenge. He would allow the knight to swing the axe at his head in an effort to decapitate him, with the proviso that he would return the blow upon the knight in a year and 1 day. Whoever accepted the challenge would win the beautiful axe, which everyone agreed was quite the prize. When it appears that none of Arthur's knights are willing to accept the challenge, Arthur himself stands up ready to take on the task. Seeing this, his nephew Gawain quickly interjects that he would like the honour instead. The giant bends down before Gawain, leaning his neck forward to ensure Gawain can strike true. With a mighty cleave, Gawain beheads the giant in one swing, sending his head rolling onto the floor. The Green Knight does not flinch or falter, instead reaching forward to pick up his own head. Upon doing so, he holds up the ghastly, smirking visage to Queen Guinevere before the writhing mouth of the head reminds Gawain that the two must meet again at the Green Chapel in a year and a day so that the blow may be returned. He then rides away head in hand, and Arthur and Gawain admire their newly acquired axe, which they hang on the wall as a form of trophy. Guinevere is worried about the repercussions, but Arthur and Gawain encourage her to treat the whole matter lightly. As the year tolls by and the day grows closer, Gawain understands that he is bound by chivalric code to keep his end of the bargain. It is a matter of honour and not one he intends to fail in. On Gawain's journey to the Green Chapel, which in some tellings takes the majority of the year, it is implied that he fights many great battles and overcomes many different enemies. One day, Gawain comes across a castle hidden in the forest. The lord of the castle and his beautiful wife are pleased to have such a renowned guest, and encourage him to come stay with them. After such an arduous journey, Gawain is greatly relieved for the offer of hospitality and enters their castle. He explains his quest to the Lord and Lady and an unnamed old crone who is treated with a great amount of respect by all attending. Gawain also explains that he only has a few days left to find the Green Chapel if he is to keep his promise of meeting his foe on the day after New Year. The Lord laughs and explains that there is a path to the chapel close by and that they are in fact only 2 miles away. The Lord proposes that Gawain rest at the castle until the appropriate date, and Gawain gratefully agrees. The Lord then proposes a second bargain. He goes hunting every day and intends to give Gawain whatever he catches on the condition that Gawain will give him whatever he may have gained during the day. In accordance with chivalric code, Gawain accepts the Lord's proposal, and when the Lord leaves the next day, his wife visits Gawain's chambers and attempts to romance him. Despite her best efforts, Gawain does not return the affection and instead gives her a single kiss so as not to offend her. Later, the Lord returns and gives Gawain the deer he has killed on his hunt. Gawain gives him a kiss without divulging where he received one. The next day, the same thing happens. The Lord's wife returns to Gawain's chambers and he once again spurns her advances. Later that evening, the Lord exchanges a boar with Gawain in return for 2 kisses. On the third day, the lady of the castle returns to Gawain and tries her best to seduce him. He continues to refuse her politely, and eventually she instead pleads with him to take a keepsake of hers with him, in the form of a golden ring. Again, Gawain refuses her, and she begs him to now instead take a golden and green sash made from silk. She tells Gawain that the sash is charmed and will keep him safe from all physical harm. Gawain is tempted by this, given that he knows it is likely that he would otherwise die the following day. Gawain accepts it, and they exchange 3 kisses. This time the lady has Gawain swear that he will keep the gift secret from her husband. That evening, the Lord returns with a fox, which he exchanges with Gawain for 3 kisses, but Gawain says nothing of the sash. The next morning, Gawain binds the sash around his waist and heads to the Green Chapel, which is actually just a mound of earth in a forest clearing. Upon arriving there, he finds the Green Knight sharpening an axe. Unwilling to break from his code of honor, Gawain leans forward to accept the blow. On the first swing of the axe, Gawain flinches, and the giant mocks him for his cowardice. On the second swing, Gawain doesn't flinch, but the Green Knight again withholds the blow short of Gawain's neck. The knight explains he was testing Gawain's courage, and Gawain yells at him to deliver the blow. The knight obliges him, but as the third strike hits Gawain's neck, only a small cut is left behind. Gawain is confused, and the Green Knight begins to let out a hearty laugh and reveals himself to be none other but the Lord of the Castle transformed by magic. He explains the entire adventure was a trick of the old crone that Gawain saw at the castle, who was actually the sorceress Morgana Le Fay, King Arthur's sister. She had wanted to test the courage of Arthur's knights and also scare Queen Guinevere to death due to their ongoing rivalry. The cut Gawain suffered to his neck was a result of his attempts to conceal the sash from the Lord, rather than fully honouring the terms of their bargain. Gawain is ashamed of this, seeing it as a brand of failure, a mark of his dishonesty, but the Green Knight laughs and professes him the most honourable and blameless knight in the kingdom, and the 2 part on cordial terms. Following this, the Knights of the Round Table absolve Gawain of any kind of guilt, and take to each wearing a green sash in recognition of Gawain's faithful adherence to chivalric code and as a reminder to always be honest in mind and noble in deed. Now, in terms of deeper meaning in that story, there is a lot going on. Some of it is pretty obvious, some of it is really wacky. There are some big themes you can probably pick up on straight away, the main one being Gawain being consistently given the option to do the unheroic thing and instead choosing to maintain his honour and trust in the chivalric code. But there's also seduction, lust, trust, loyalty, nature, magic, triptych motifs, potential homosexuality, merging of different mythos, and specifically the Christian expansion over paganism. The list goes on, and there's a lot to unpack. And a lot of that we will be touching on here, but all of it will certainly be featured in my video in depth when the film actually comes out. Alright, let's get started breaking down this newest trailer. So we open on a panning shot of what is presumably Camelot, as Sean Harris's King Arthur provides a voiceover, which is Arthur welcoming the knights to the New Year's celebration. We see Dev Patel enter, and then we get this fade through of a green seal, symbolizing the bond, the deal that is made, and what looks to be a full moon. And the moons, the seasons, the years, the natural cycle, they're all a really big part of the narrative, and the main link to the whole green theme that's present. So seeing the green seal fade into the moon is essentially acknowledging that relationship. But as the shot continues, it becomes clear that rather than a moon, we're actually looking upwards through the mouth of a well or some other cavernous exit. We hear the voiceover of Arthur asking for someone to regale him and his queen with some myth, and this is extremely close to what happens in the original story. Before the entrance of the Green Knight, Arthur asks his knights to tell him a story of their adventure. We then see what looks to be witches preparing a spell of some kind, seemingly something restorative and again in tune with the natural world. This is a much more traditionally English or even Wiccan paganistic take on witchcraft, as opposed to the more Maleficent style spellcasters we see Morgana Le Fay and Merlin traditionally depicted as. And then we get the entrance or the interruption of the Green Knight, which just looks awesome. I am so excited for this movie. We've got the A24 logo with this kind of Christian halo motif that we saw on the crowns in trailer 1. And then we get close-ups of both the Green Knight and Gawain, and we can see that they've very much gone for the natural, more Old English and Celtic mythos for the Green Knight, where he's almost treant-like in appearance. On closer inspection, it looks as though he's wearing a mask, so it's unclear as to exactly which parts of him are disguise versus actual monster. I'll go in deep on all of the different cultural myths and monsters that were influencing factors on the original Green Knight in my full video. Dev Patel is obviously not the traditional depiction of Gawain. I think he looks great though. The film has a seriously cool art style, but nevertheless Dev Patel is carrying the look of this movie firmly on his shoulders. His character design is awesome, his costuming, the more hallucinatory scenes of his ascension, it all looks great. I love this more down to earth but still kind of weird and sickly, maybe grotesque look that there is to everything in Camelot. It's dark and muddy and not glorious and refined. Realist looking, but with these insane dips into the fantastical. So moving on, we see who I presume to be Merlin shaking his head at Arthur to not make a deal with the beast. Again, there's this really cool like Gaelic or Celtic paganism look to Merlin that's more grounded in reality than a lot of depictions. We hear the Green Knight lay out the terms of the beheading game as Gawain takes up a blade which may be Excalibur, but I think is more likely Gawain's sword, which is reasonably famous in its own right. In some stories, Gawain is the other wielder of Excalibur alongside Arthur, but he also has his own sword named Galuth or Galatine in Morte d'Arthur. We then get some extremely quick cuts of different scenes. This is presumably Morgana Le Fay, but it may be the Green Knight looking at that head shape. This is what looks to be Dev Patel unconscious in a pool of blood, and then another shot of Gawain reflected in maybe a baptismal pool, as it looks like he's getting ready to wear the crown halo that we see him don in the first trailer. We see a dilapidated gravesite, a freaked out Gawain, a vision of a deceased Gawain, and finally the metal halo crown we see in both the first trailer and the A24 logo strewn onto the ground. Following all these quick cuts, we see Gawain slicing the head from the Green Knight and then turning back round, presumably in realization that decapitation was not enough to kill this monster. Then, just like in the original story, we see the Green Knight raise his own head and remind Gawain of the terms of their bargain before riding out of the castle cackling all the way. We get a good shot of the Knights of the Round Table and the table itself. It's pretty clear that Arthur's adventures have taken him beyond the confines of Britain. Gawain isn't the only non-white member of the group, and so it's likely they've been relatively far afield. I think that's really cool. There's a tendency to close off Arthurian myth and keep it confined within southern England, mainly because people aren't really sure as to how and where it fits in historically or geographically. But here, and with the Green Knight's description of Arthur as the greatest of kings, we get the impression that he's more part of a world, that he's had interactions with other kings and has gained renown for his deeds. We also get a sense of dread and kind of the realization of fear here, which in the original story is largely played down in favor of bravado. We get an awesome shot of the axe, which is being locked away here rather than displayed as a trophy, which is an interesting change given the prevalence of hunting in the story. We get some awesome shots of this little play wheel for kids' performances that depicts the seasons as Arthur laments the passing of another year. Now, it may be nothing, but based on both trailers, I am feeling this sense of sickness and blighted earth to the Kingdom of Camelot, and this focus on withered trees and snowy earth while Arthur discusses the passing of another year seems to suggest that as well. Of course, the year passing also means it's time for Gawain to uphold his bargain, and following this we see Arthur and Gawain discussing Gawain's need to seek out the Green Knight and fulfill his duty. They are unsure as to whether or not it's a game being played by the Knight, but they understand either way that Gawain must participate and stay true to his word. We see Gawain set off on his quest, and then we get this narration from the satanic-sounding fox that he will find no salvation, no mercy. Now, there is a fox in the original story, as I mentioned, but this is definitely playing fast and loose with that. While this trailer is very on point in terms of making it look like it's following the story exactly, this is the first inkling that some things are going to go very differently, and I think the phrase, "your doom is at hand," is pretty clear in its intention. While it may all be part of testing Gawain's nerve, I think the more likely answer is that we're going to see Gawain go through a much more dramatic fight for survival. And given A24's track record, I'm not extremely hopeful for Gawain's survival this time. We see Gawain attack the fox out of frustration, which is relatively un-Gawain-like behavior, and again points to him having a much harder test psychologically and spiritually spiritually than he traditionally would. We then see Gawain being accosted by a band of scavengers who take his axe and leave him tied up in the same position we saw the skeleton in earlier. Combined with Barry Keogh's character telling him to rest his bones, I think this is definitely a safe bet that the skeleton is a vision of Gawain. Interestingly, it seems rather than wanting Gawain dead, they want to complete his task for him. They want to steal his honor. While his writhing here may seem like he's in a rush to be decapitated, it's more that he knows he'll be a coward if he can't complete his task, and for him that's far worse than death. We see a shot of Dev Patel in armor and wearing his crown halo. And we also see both Arthur and Guinevere wearing the same kind of crown, so this is clearly denoting him as prince, or at least of royal blood. I love how these crowns are so clearly influenced by medieval and Christian artwork. They're not particularly bound to any kind of historical realism, but they're spot on in terms of how kings and other holy figures were depicted in artwork at the time. We get this incredible shot of Gawain looking out to a valley of giants. This is presumably part of his travels to the Green Chapel that essentially represent a fill-in-the-blank section in the original story. There is precedent for giants in Arthurian myth, although they're more like giants like how the Green Knight is giant. That being said, there is plenty of precedent for giants of this scope in Welsh and Irish folklore, which is where Arthurian myth takes some of its roots from, the other contributing factors being England and France. And I think that's important because those cultures, specifically Gaelic and Celtic, were paganistic, and a lot of the Arthurian myth is referential of Christianity's conquering of paganism. The Green Knight, or Green Man, is 100% a paganistic symbol, and here as Gawain ventures further into the pagan realm towards the Green Chapel, we see more outlandish and fantastical things than we saw in the realist Christian Camelot. A few more quick shots and we finally get to see Joel Edgerton, who I think did his best work in The King, in a similar medieval setting. I think he's playing the Lord of the Castle and Alicia Vikander is playing the Lady of the Castle, and I think around there is where stuff is really going to start going off script in terms of sticking to the original. So I doubt we'll see much from them in the trailers, even though they share top billing with Dev Patel. Joel Edgerton asks, "What do you hope to gain?" And this is in line with the Lord's request for Gawain to give him whatever he gains during the day. Joel Edgerton's beard is also shaped the same as the root beard on the Green Knight, and his character poster features a rather lordly hunting crossbow. So I think it's pretty safe to say that part of the story isn't going to be much of a secret. Another amazing shot of Gawain and the fox being accosted by the giant. Seemingly Gawain didn't have much luck trying to kill the fox with the axe. And following that, probably my favourite shot across both trailers is Gawain sat in this position made famous by early Christian kings like Justinian I, and this was a tradition that carried on for a long time, notably with Queen Elizabeth I. Even our current queen has a scepter and an orb with a crucifix as part of the crown jewels. And speaking of Queen Elizabeth I, I honestly have no idea who this is, but visually she is reminiscent of Elizabeth I, but also the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland, so it's probably just a coincidence. Time-wise, they're way too far apart for that to make sense, so if anyone knows who this character is, please let me know in the comments down below. My guess is that it's Morgana Le Fay, just because we're kind of running out of female characters, and that could explain why the character is currently uncredited, but I'm 100% positive that this is Morgana on the poster artwork, because she has the same blindfolding the crone does, and we know that the crone is Morgana, and this person doesn't really look the same, so I'm kind of stumped as to who this is right now. Moving on from that, we see Dev Patel answer Joel Edgerton's earlier question of what does he hope to gain, and the answer is honor, and that's entirely in line with ideas of chivalric code and Gawain's motivations during the original story, but I get the feeling it's going to be tested and problematized quite barbarically before we get to the end, because it's an A24 film, so a fairy tale ending is pretty much out of the question. Despite whatever gets in his way, Gawain makes it to the Green Chapel, and the trailer closes with him explaining chivalric code to the Green Knight there, saying that is why a knight does what he does. And then we get the awesome logo to close out. I'm so hyped for this, it looks phenomenal already. I think this trailer definitely tries to sell you on this being a more traditional retelling. The first trailer was way more abstract and trippy. This one seems to want to give you a clearer idea of what the story is going to be. But like I've said, I don't think A24 are interested in traditional retellings, and I expect the actual film to lean heavily on the fantasy and sort of hallucinatory and psychological elements, rather than trying to stick too literally to the original. I think there's definitely going to be a focus on two things predominantly more than we may see them featured in the original story, those being nature and sexuality. Sex is a big part of the story, but we've also come a long way over 600 years, and what may be a kiss in the original, I think we can presume safely may not be here. All the way up until this century, sex on the page and anywhere else has been considered heavily taboo, and as far as chivalric romance is concerned, a kiss is as far as we were going. So I expect it to be quite sexed up, and I also expect the environment and nature to be more of a concern, because it is for us in this present moment, and that's something that plays heavily in the original story. Man man's relationship with, or rather dominion over nature. This may be why Camelot seems blighted and sickly. There may be a focus on man living out of sync with nature, that man is the blight on the land, and that this natural magic and the Green Knight are agents of these natural laws that want the balance righted. I think the closer answer, though, is that Christianity and developing infrastructure are kind of removing pagan magic from the land and severing man's long-standing bond with nature. I think while chivalric code has to ubiquitously play a large role in this film, that it's seemingly being conflated with Christian ideals and ideology. In the first trailer particularly, there was a heavy focus on Christian imagery. Now, there's always been a long-standing relationship between the two, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the chivalric stuff is put forward as Christian duty and religious morality just to provide a clearer through line to a modern audience. And I wouldn't be surprised if we ultimately see the Christian side of things, rather than the pagan and the naturalistic, as being what the film is ultimately critical of. Lastly, I do not think we're going to see the same ending that we're used to at all. I don't think, and it turns out it was all a trick, is the vibe that we're going for at all here. I think the images of a burning Gawain ascending to the throne speak to a much more problematic and troubled character, and that pride may be an undoing for him here. From everything we see, it certainly doesn't look like he's working on the side of good or joy, but rather unthinking Christian superiority, which I think we'll see brought heavily into question as we move through the movie. Whatever the case, I think this all looks incredibly exciting, and I cannot wait for the 6th of August. That's all I've got for you right now. I actually have an hour-long video on Promising Young Woman that will be dropping shortly. It's all recorded. I'm just adding all the visuals in now, and I'm aiming to have that with you as soon as possible. Beyond that, I have a lot more stuff coming, and I'm really trying to increase the frequency at which I drop videos, so make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Before I go, I'd just like to say a special thank you to the people who've decided to start supporting me on Patreon. It means the world to me, and it's one step closer to being able to provide a lot more content. Thanks so much to them, and thanks to every one of you for watching. I'll see you soon with a new video, and expect a lot more on The Green Knight when the film releases. Peace.